So in the last section, we were talking about signs and symptoms, and so we also, just quickly, I wanted to mention this, that sometimes microbes are asymptomatic. Sometimes infections are asymptomatic. So put A in front of a word, and it means without. All right, so asymptomatic just means that you don't actually show signs. You don't actually show symptoms. And so the problem with that is you don't know that you have an infection. You don't know that you have a microbe, so you don't seek medical attention, but there's always the potential that whatever it is that you have, you could be spreading it. So definitely have to worry about those infections that are asymptomatic. And so the last stage in infection that we mentioned here is portal of exit. So just to remind you that anything that was a portal of entry can also double as a portal of exit. And so microbes are able to exit through respiratory, salivary portal, so through your mouth, your nose. They're able to exit through the skin. As you shed skin cells, they can exit with that. Fecal exit, a large component of feces is microbes. Urogenital tract, blood or bleeding can be a way that portal of exit as far as microbes are concerned. So definitely something that you'd want to be aware of as far as how microbes leave your system. Now, a couple quick things that they mention at the end, nothing too fancy here, but that latency, remember these are the ability of a microbe to kind of go dormant, right? And then later on to become active again. And so definitely something that you see sometimes with microbes is latency. They also mention chronic carrier, so a person with a latent infection that sheds the infection agent, spreads it to someone else, could be an issue down the road. So this is an interesting field right now, epidemiology. So it's the study of frequency and distribution of disease. So right now we have doctors and scientists that are studying diseases, their frequency of coming back up, and their distribution as far as the world is concerned. And so this involves not just micro, but also involves anatomy and physiology, immunology, medicine, psychology, sociology, ecology, statistics, all these types of things. And so in epidemiology, we're considering diseases and basically where in the world they're causing problems, how often they cause problems, and kind of their chain of infection. So it's a really interesting field right now. And the ultimate goal is just it's knowledge, right? It's being able to understand microbes, kind of how they're working, who they infect, and as humans, how do we deal with these things, right? So how do we combat these frequent diseases? How do we combat these microbes that are becoming deadly in certain parts of the world? So the last thing that we want to consider is kind of how microbes are transmitted. And so they mention a couple of vocabulary words for transmission, one being a reservoir, the other being a source, right? So reservoir is the primary habitat of the pathogen, right? So reservoir could be a human reservoir, it could be another animal. Reservoir could be soil. So that pathogen could be found in the water, could be found in plants. So reservoir is the primary location where you'd find that microbe. Okay. A source is an individual or an object from which an infection is actually acquired. So what did you actually catch it from? Okay. The reservoir could be the source, right? Or the reservoir could be where the source got the microbe and then spread it to other people. So some vocabulary words that they mentioned there. They also mention carriers, right? So carrier, another word for a source, right? It's another word for an organism that spreads a pathogen. And so a carrier can either be asymptomatic, where they show no symptoms. That's a common one that we see. They can be passive carriers, where they are actually a healthcare provider that transfers it to other patients, right? But again, they themselves don't necessarily see the symptoms, so they don't know that they have it. We also mentioned there's incubation carriers, there are convalescent carriers, there are chronic carriers, so lots of different types of carriers, all of these helping to kind of transfer or transmit microbes to other people. They also mention a vector, and we're going to talk more about these as we get into some further units down the road, but a vector is typically a live animal, and it's going to transmit an infectious agent from one host to the other. The most common vectors we see are arthropods, which include our insects, right? So fleas, mosquitoes, flies, ticks, those are very common vectors that we see. We note, though, that sometimes it's larger animals, right? There's a lot of rodents that are known to carry infections from one to the other. So it mentions the difference between a biological vector and a mechanical vector. So biological vectors actively participate in the pathogen's life cycle. Mosquitoes tend to do that, right? Mechanical vectors, they're just there for transport. They typically do not become infected in the process. Okay, so they're just typically there to transport, where biological vectors, not only do they transport the microbe, but it also can infect them as well. One term we see a lot with these types of infections are what we call zoonotic infections, or zoonosis. So this is where the infection is indigenous to animals, but it gets transmitted to humans. So for example, swine flu is a zoonotic infection, right? So pigs, but can be transmitted to humans. We think about West Nile, right? West Nile, found in mosquitoes, transmitted to humans. So a large majority of the emerging diseases that we're seeing worldwide are zoonotic infections. So it's things that we're catching from animals, things that we're catching from other species and other organisms. So becoming a huge issue. Now here's just some of the more common ones. I mentioned West Nile, but look at rabies, some fevers like yellow fever, viral fevers like Lassa, things like that, hantavirus, the flu, influenza, Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So a lot of these issues, but they're all zoonotic. So these are things that we're catching from other types of microbes. I also mentioned the difference between communicable and non-communicable diseases, some vocabulary words that we see. So if they're communicable diseases, this is when a host can actually transmit the microbe to another host, right? So communicable means that they're contagious, right? Something that you give to someone else. A non-communicable disease is typically one that you gave to yourself. So this is typically normal biota, you became compromised, it moved to a different area of your body, and it led to an endogenous infection. And so communicable is something you caught from someone else, non-communicable, one that you yourself basically triggered. And then as far as patterns of transmission, we mentioned it can be transmitted directly or indirectly, right? So directly, physical contact, or aerosol droplets like a sneeze gave to you, or then indirectly we think about it passed through some type of intermediate. So whether it was food, whether it was water, fomites like inanimate objects that we see, or even some other types of airborne things. They also mentioned the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic. So epidemic, typically prevalence of a disease is increasing, so it's becoming a problem. Pandemic is when it's becoming a problem across continents, so in multiple parts of the world, difference between those terms. You can kind of see some examples of that. They also mentioned nosocomial infections. So in healthcare, this is something that we're trying to be really careful about, because we know that nosocomial infections, these are diseases that you acquired while you were at the hospital. And so these happen for a variety of reasons. One, you got to think about who's at the hospital, right? So these are already people that are immunocompromised, right? They're also there bringing with them whatever ailment they had, right? So you get this collection of microbes in an area with people that already have weakened immune systems. We've got a lot of surgical procedures happening, so we got a lot of people getting opened up, and so that just increases your chances of nosocomial infections. So we see, lots of these things happen. And so one of the ways that we can try to combat that is the idea of universal precautions, right? So stringent measures to try to prevent the spread of these from patient to patient, from patient to worker, from worker to patient. So we just assume that everything is biohazardous. We just assume that everything has microbes on it, and if we treat it as such, the idea would be that it would decrease the number of these types of infections that we see.